He sold his own town to the Confederate Army. Then he was captured by Abraham Lincoln's government for the trouble. And before all of that, before the war, before the ruin, before the panic of 1873 nearly buried him, he was a 19-year-old farm boy from Maryland who walked into the office of the richest man in America and asked him a single naked question. How can I make $1 million? Not a metaphor, not ambition in the abstract. A direct demand for the secret, put to A.T. Stewart, to the Astors, to the founder of the New York Herald, in a single 14-hour train ride in the year 1858. And what those money kings told him would carry him through a civil war fought across his own front yard and through the worst financial collapse the young republic had ever seen. This is not a history lesson. This is his private memoir.
Everyone remembers the remark of the late Dr. William Osler, that initiative comes from men under 40, and that older men might as well be chloroformed. Dr. Osler was one of my warm friends, and just before he left for his chair at Oxford, he asked me to dinner at his home in Baltimore. I asked him whether I thought I ought to retire. I was then approaching 70. He answered me, "No, you have not yet reached 40. The years have nothing to do with it. It is one's mental and physical condition that makes age. You will probably be young as long as you live." I have now behind me more than twice that fatal 40, on the calendar count. I have known most of the great figures of this nation across 60 years. I have watched a farming country become a manufacturing one, and watched manufacturing grow from little shop handwork into great shop machine work. But yesterday matters to me only as its experience becomes a mentor for today. If that were not so, I would drop yesterday entirely, and be wholly as young as on the morning long ago when I set out for New York to ask the money kings a single question. It was 1858, and I was not yet 20. There were no modern recipes for making $1 million overnight, sold by subscription. There were practically no books of business instruction at all. One simply grew up, like Topsy, in business. But I happened across an issue of Harper's Magazine that described the successful men of New York, and I became fired with the notion that the way to get ahead faster than the next fellow was to find the secrets of those who had made the high scores. It was not greed. My father had taught me that no man could properly be called a man who let his love for $1 interfere with his love for a book. Still, I wanted to be successful in business, and so I compressed the whole of that ambition into one query, the one I thought would most attract these great men. How can I make $1 million? That was a great adventurous journey, and by today's standards, a hard one. The trains were slow, the stops frequent, and whenever you dozed off, the yell came to change cars. There were, of course, no sleepers. It took 14 hours of traveling before the ferry from Jersey landed me in what I thought was a very big city. It was 7 in the morning. The New York of today would call that big city nothing but a fair-sized town. There were no great buildings. Few had more than 3 stories. They were mostly of red brick, plain and solid. Above Canal Street it was open country, and Canal Street itself was a canal. I distinctly remember the boats upon it. I left my bag at the old Astor Hotel, and without waiting for breakfast, started straight for William B. Astor's office. I reached it about 8 o'clock. He had 2 little rooms. In the outer was an old, round-shouldered clerk. In the back, writing at a plain board table, was a heavy-set man with a full face and bushy brows. I knew him at once from the magazine picture, Mr. Astor. The furniture was unpolished, there were no decorations, and a rough mental inventory gave me a total value of about $20. The clerk glared at me without welcome and growled, "What do you want?" I said I wanted to see Mr. Astor. "You cannot see him. He is busy." Then he made a grab at my coat as I tried to dive past him. I shook him off and landed, somewhat ruffled, before the desk of the richest man in the country. He had heard the scuffle. Looking up from his writing, he snapped, "Well, boy, what do you want?" I drew up a chair beside him and said, "I want to know how to make $1 million. And right away his testiness left him. He smiled, just a little, and answered ruefully, "Do you want to make yourself as miserable as I am? To stay up all day and half the night, trying to keep people from cheating you? I never made any money myself. It takes all my time to collect rents and to see that people do not get away without paying." Then he told me to sit, and he explained how his father had believed New York would grow into a great city, and had bought land cheaply along the path he thought the city would take. As the streets were cut through, he sold off all but the corners, and rented those, and he, the son, was simply collecting the rents. He spoke about the power of invested money. He referred feelingly to what would have happened if old Moses, as he called his father, had only put a single penny out at interest and let it go on compounding. "But," he went on, "there is nothing in it. I do not have enough fun. I am too afraid people will cheat me, and in spite of everything, they do cheat me. If you really want to know how to make money," he said, "go see the men who have made it, not men who do nothing but try to keep what they have." I showed him my list. "Go see Stevens at the Bank of Commerce. See A.T. Stewart. He made his own money. There is George S. Coe at the American Exchange Bank. He is a nice fellow. And James Gordon Bennett has good ideas." As I left, he asked whether I expected to see all those men. I said yes, and that I would tell them Mr. Astor had sent me. "Don't do anything of the kind," he returned snappishly. "I am going to anyhow," I answered, my courage rising. "It is true. You did tell me to see them." He laughed a little and said, "All right, go ahead. You'll do." Men went to their offices early in those days. They used all of the daylight. Shortly after 9 o'clock, I stood at the office of John A. Stevens in the Bank of Commerce, a 4-story building of white marble, almost the finest in the city, at the corner of Cedar and Nassau Streets. To me, it was very imposing. That bank was important even then, but only later, during the Civil War, did people learn how truly big a man President Stevens was. To my own knowledge, he answered a call from President Lincoln and helped finance the first $50 million loan of the war. I told the attendant Mr. Astor had sent me, and at once I was shown in. Stevens had a somewhat better desk than Astor, but there was nothing of the modern banker about the place. All very plain, with no thought that one must make a showing in order to look financially solid. Of all the men I met that day, Only A.T. Stewart dressed and acted the part of a rich man. The others fell decidedly below my notion of how a rich man should look. When I told Stevens that Astor had sent me to learn how to make $1 million, he laughed. "I am in the same boat with Astor," he said. "I never made any money. All I do is take care of money other people make. The man for you is George S. Coe, and I shall send you straight over to him. He has a board meeting this morning, and if you get in, you will meet men who can tell you more than I can." So a messenger escorted me around to the little building of the American Exchange Bank. George S. Coe was, I believe, the youngest bank executive in New York, then vice president, later president. He, too, was glad to see me. The Astor name had carried me along. He asked me to wait until the board met, when he would call me in. Imagine a metropolitan bank president today holding his board together to talk with an unknown young man, Mart, who wished to learn how to make $1 million. But by then I was quite at ease in the higher financial circles. They all spoke with me, and the code of those men was extremely simple. The most striking recipe they offered was this: take care of your character. Never break a promise. Give value for what you get, and avoid speculation. An old man I met there, I believe it was Hamilton Fish, put it this way: if you never break a promise, if you always pay the money you owe exactly on the day it is due, nobody will know but that you are worth $1 million, and you will be just as good a risk as a man worth $1 million, for all that he could do is pay on the due date. They had no shortcuts. Not one even spoke of technical proficiency. They were concerned only with fundamentals, that if one were scrupulously honest, industrious, and economical, the other business qualities came almost as a matter of course. Without those, nothing else mattered. And here is a point I have never seen dwelt upon. What made those men rich was not only honesty and high character. It was their extraordinary memories. There were no bookkeeping systems worth the name. The books showed income and outgo, nothing of costs or overhead. A great merchant kept his entire business under his hat. He knew what things cost, what they ought to cost, what they ought to sell for. He knew the accounts of every customer. He knew his bank balance day by day, and every outstanding bill, all in his head. It was the ability to do that, and to judge character and value as by intuition, that distinguished the big man from the little one. From the bank meeting, I went to see the founder of the New York Herald, James Gordon Bennett, at his office near the old Astor House on Broadway. Everyone had told me by all means to see both Bennett and Stewart. I had no trouble seeing him. He sat alone at a plain desk. I began to tell him what I wanted. But before I had said half a dozen words, and just as I began to feel his remarkably keen eyes looking right through me, he broke in. "Look here, young man. You look as though you had not eaten breakfast." And it was true. So caught up was I in my quest that it had not occurred to me to eat anything. Too many affairs of importance had been happening to warrant bothering with breakfast. "Whenever you see anyone," he said, "you ought to be at your best. You cannot be at your best if you are hungry. Go get your breakfast, Then come back and we shall talk. Give this card to the head waiter at the Astor House." I crossed the street, gave the card to the head waiter, who escorted me ceremoniously to a seat and served me himself, which, let me say, was a full-sized man's task, because the moment I sat down, I realized I was about as hungry as a boy can be. He stood beside me as I ate, and we talked of various New York men, and especially of Mr. Bennet. When I finished, I asked for my bill. The waiter answered, "There is nothing to pay. This is Mr. Bennet's treat. He frequently sends people over here." I went straight back to the Herald, filled with a determination to pay for my own meal, for I could not see why anyone should spend money on me. I raised the subject. He dismissed it instantly. "Nonsense. Let's talk of something important. The really important thing for a young man to know is that you must bank up a health account. Look at me. I am never sick. I never take a vacation. I am here early and sometimes late, but I always get to bed early enough for a good night's sleep. If you get plenty of sleep and are careful of your diet," he said, "you will never be sick." I think that advice was good. I have rarely been ill. Through many years I worked at least 15 hours a day, yet always got 6 hours of sound sleep. And I still arrive at my office at 7 in the morning. Franklin said 6 hours is enough for a man, 7 for a woman, 8 for a fool. All the men I had seen so far were glad to talk with me, but they warned that I might have trouble with A.T. Stewart, who had a reputation for austerity. At his great establishment, I was shown to his floor. Instead of hiding in a private room, Stewart kept his desk behind a glass partition in the corner, an observation post from which he could watch everyone at work. The attendant said it was impossible to see him. He had just gone home to dinner. But after I used Mr. Astor's name, we grew friendly, and he offered me a plan. "Mr. Stewart will come out of his house at exactly 1:15 with a newspaper in his hand. He will board a bus. You get on, take the seat beside him, and when he looks up from his paper, but not before, then you start to talk." The plan worked, though I shivered as I watched him read, for he looked to me a remarkably cold, stern, unapproachable man. I do not recall exactly what I first said, but he soon took interest, especially when I told him what other prominent men had said of him. I went with him from the bus into his office. As we passed an aisle, a man was sweeping, and Stewart's eye caught some rags among the litter. Rags were far more valuable then. This was before wood pulp was used in paper making. He stopped at once, walked over, and in an imperious voice reprimanded the sweeper for his wastefulness. In the office, I asked, "Did it not cost more of your time to speak to that man than the rags were worth?" "That's true," he answered. "But you will notice I spoke so loudly that everyone in the room heard me. I meant them to. It was a lesson in saving, for money is made by saving, saving and investing. You get your profit out of the leaks that you stop. Every penny saved," he said, "ought to be invested. And the place to invest was in your own business, up to the point you can use the money there profitably. Save so that whenever your business needs money, you can supply it yourself and never have to borrow." I believe he followed that principle scrupulously. Then I asked whether it was true that, in choosing men for important places, he preferred men who had been in business and failed. His reply was characteristic. "It is a great advantage," he said, "to have men who have been in business for themselves and failed. The mere fact that they started shows initiative and ambition, very valuable qualities. The fact that they failed on their own account shows them they are not competent to manage their own affairs, and that their best interest lies in casting their lot with those who know more. This ensures loyalty. Of course," he added, "these men must have failed honestly. I look carefully into the facts. I do not take a man whose record is bad. But if his failure came simply from inability to look after his own affairs, with no trace of sharp dealing, he is the best man for me." A.T. Stewart was the absolute master of his business. As I have said, all the men I met were heads of one-man concerns. Astor was the Astor estate. Bennett was the Herald. They were despots, absolute rulers, and they were inclined to be paternal. It was unconscious paternalism that made Bennett give me a meal ticket. The sternest of them all was Stewart. Every one of them gave orders where the modern executive merely makes suggestions. They were elemental men. They worked with things, while the man of today works with people. They were pioneers, and I suppose a pioneer gets pretty well calloused all over. However much we admire their granite firmness, the big man of today is, I think, more interested in humanity, thinks less of himself and more of those about him. I cannot help comparing them with Mr. Carnegie. About 25 years ago, we were talking of work. I told him I reached the office at 7 each morning. He laughed and said, "You must be a lazy man if it takes you 10 hours to do a day's work. What I do," he said, "is get good men, and I never give them orders. My directions seldom go beyond suggestions. In the morning, I take their reports. Within an hour, I have disposed of everything, sent out my suggestions. The day's work is done, and I am ready to go enjoy myself." And that is the most striking contrast between the men of yesterday and those of today. On the mere matter of making money, Carnegie made more than all the men I have mentioned put together. They were individualists, not managers. That trip to New York marked the turning point of my life, the end of as healthy and natural a childhood as any boy ever had. I went home to Maryland carrying their words: character, promises kept, value given, leaks stopped, money saved and invested in your own work. I would need every one of them. We lived in an old log house, afterward weather-boarded, with a barn built years before by one Ellis Pugh. It was called Cedar Lawn, for the cedars scattered between the house and the gate. Our neighborhood about the post office was known as Sandy Spring, in Montgomery County, Maryland, 18 miles from Washington. I remember distinctly the great bonfires at the barbecues that ended the Harrison and Tyler campaign in 1840, though I was but 2 years old. And the next year, when Harrison died, I plainly heard the booming of the minute guns fired in Washington. Washington meant a great deal to us, though it was then only a sprawling village of mud roads and fewer than 15,000 souls. My father often took me there. We rode the steamboat that had begun to ply between Washington and Alexandria. I remember especially the great rocking beam swinging up and down to drive the side wheels. I thought it all very wonderful. I think now that the machinery fixed something in me. Sandy Spring was a remarkable little community, mostly Quakers, descendants of the first settlers. Its plain country savings bank holds deposits now exceeding $1 million. The prosperous Mutual Fire Insurance Company of Montgomery County has its principal office there. That quiet place understood money better than its modesty suggested. My father was a man of learning. He mastered Latin at 12, Greek at 13 or 14, was clever in mathematics, and an expert in botany and other sciences. There seemed nothing in which he was not interested. Like the old Roman, he had a part in everything human. He never learned French and came to Sandy Spring at about 20. Margaret Briggs, who knew the language, undertook to teach him French while he taught her chess. The bargain was duly carried out, and naturally they fell in love and married. So you see, even my own beginnings were a fair trade. Value given for value received. I was born at Cedar Lawn, half a mile from the old Sharon house. I remember as if it were yesterday, my grandmother sitting by the open fire in the Franklin stove, the folding doors cutting off the draught, the mantelpiece my great-grandfather made with his own hands. When my great-grandfather built that house, one could have walked from it to Canada without seeing a white settler. All was woodland and wild waste. His was among the first houses in the neighborhood. We came from people who started with nothing and built on a frontier, and that, too, was in me. In those days, swearing was held a great sin. The Negroes about us were very religious. I never heard an oath among them. I never swore an oath in my life. I was but 6 or 7 when these things were discussed, and I put swearing down as one of the things I would never do. And those things I decided in my immature mind not to do, I have not done. We were taught the sacredness of the sexes and the respect due to women. When I left for York, my mother gave me an injunction I have always kept. She told me never to forget the lessons of home, that God might often seem far off in the heavens, and I might forget his existence. But thee will not be likely to forget my existence, she said. Remember that I am with thee all the time. Don't do anything thee would be ashamed to do before me. I have always endeavored to keep that rule. Another conclusion we reached as a family was that one must give value for value received, that we have no right to anything in this world unless we give value for it. There are 1,000 ways to give value. You can be a comfort to your parents, kind to them, never causing worry, and so repay what they lavished on you before you could earn your own way. When we grew older, each of us children was given a daily task. This was unusual in our section, where Negroes were expected to do all the work. But we were taught that work was honorable, that by the sweat of our brow we must live. During vacations we had our tasks each morning and only the afternoons for play, and we enjoyed them more for it. My afternoons I usually spent in the shop my father gave me in the barn, where there was a lathe and other tools. Down in the woods we had a dam. and at 8 or 9 I built a boat. I was always tinkering with machinery, and at last could make wheelbarrows and other things used about the farm. At about 12, I began experimenting with a threshing machine, and worked at it until I left for York, though I could never get it into practical shape. That very anxiety to make a thresher that would work had much to do with my eventually going to York as an apprentice in a shop that built threshers. So the boy's failure pointed straight to the man's trade. The people of Sandy Spring were very sociable. A dozen would come in their sleighs in winter without any notice at all, expecting supper. Sometimes we had no cook, but half a dozen girls would go into the kitchen and, in the greatest good humor, cook the meal. Maryland biscuit always a feature. Then pitch in afterward to clear the dishes, and seem to enjoy the lending of a hand. Then we would roast chestnuts and play games, chiefly the asking of conundrums and riddles. My mother had a marvelous facility for answering any question, faster than anyone. While the others sat pondering, she would already be smiling, the answer in hand. She often had to keep silent to give the rest a fair chance. My uncle, Isaac Briggs, was an athlete, fond of nature and long walks. I remember his tales of trips to the far west, which in those days meant as far as Indiana or Illinois. He carried a flintlock pistol and kept it under his pillow at night for protection. One night in a lonely cabin, he was woken by the door opening. A man crept in holding a big, shining knife. By the moonlight, Isaac reached for his pistol and made ready. The man stepped to the bed, raised the knife, and just as Isaac was about to fire, the stranger reached up to cut a piece of dried meat hanging from the rafters overhead. The horror of having come so near to killing an innocent man made him resolve never to carry a firearm again. When I once asked him, "Uncle Isaac, what do you do when you get tired?" he answered, "Sonny, when I get tired on the road, I pick up a big rock, put it on my shoulder, and carry it a piece. And when I throw it off, then I feel rested again." He knew snakes, which were poisonous and which were not, and often carried one or two. He had learned that very few are poisonous. Once he came into a quilting party with his high hat full of snakes and set it brim down in the center of the quilt. As they crawled out across it, frightening the women, he was mightily amused. Life in those days seems, looking back, entirely free from friction. We lived so simply. No moving pictures, no shows, no amusements as known today. A box of candy was a magnificent thing. We always had donuts for Christmas breakfast, and kept the custom long after I came to York. Only a few years ago did we stop, as a reminder of old times. When I was about 12, my father, with his sister, started a ladies' boarding school at Fair Hill, near Olney, which became quite celebrated. He ran the farm, too, made his family comfortable, incurred no debts, and left a substantial property when he died, of which I refused to accept any part, turning my share over to my mother and sister. I meant to give value for what I took. I would not take what I had not earned. In our family, besides my sister Ellen, were my brothers Hallowell, Edward, the 2 Henrys, and Alan. Edward, at only 7 or 8, once vanished for hours, We found him in the evening in the woods with a copy of Paradise Lost, busy memorizing it. In a few weeks, he had the whole poem by heart, and recited it when we found time to listen. But the real genius was the first Henry, who died before he was 4. He seemed to know things by intuition. My parents did not know he could read at all until one evening, when he was about 2.5, our friend Richard Bentley took the pretty, bright boy on his knee with a book in hand, and little Henry began to read.
The boy who memorized those 4 money kings on a 14-hour train ride grew into a man who tested every word of their advice against fire. He built a manufacturing fortune in York, Pennsylvania, and then watched the Confederate Army march into his town, where he negotiated its surrender to spare it from the torch, only to be arrested by Lincoln's own government for dealing with the enemy. And when the Panic of 1873 wiped out the savings of a generation, Arthur Farquhar held to the oldest rule he was ever given: pay exactly on the day it is due, and you are as good as a man worth a million, and clawed his way back to prove the title of his own book true. The first million, he learned, is the hardest. He lived to make several more, and to write it all down on New Year's Day, 1922, greeting his readers, as he put it, from the Sunset Trail. But the archive holds another voice, far older and far stranger. A Venetian merchant who left home as a young man and spent 24 years inside the courts of Kublai Khan, counting the wealth of an empire the West did not believe existed. Paper money, black stones that burned like coal, cities of a scale no European had ever dreamed. His name was Marco Polo, and when he came home, no one believed a word of it, until they opened his ledgers. Click here and step into the road east, where the gold was so plentiful that the truth itself sounded like a lie, and the only question that mattered was the same one a Maryland farm boy once asked the Astors: